everyone. My name is Amanda Harris. I'm the student coordinator for Soup with Substance, and I'd like to welcome you all to Soup with Substance. Soup with Substance is a program that highlights social justice and peacemaking topics for a simple lunch of soup and bread. And our sponsor for the soup is the Center for Peacemaking. Just wanted to let everyone know this event today. And Carissa from the Center for Peacemaking will be introducing our speakers and topic for the day.
Awesome. Thanks, Amanda. I am just getting our slides up really fast. Sorry, my laptop's lagging a little bit. Can everyone see the slides now? I can't see anyone, so if someone could.
Yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you. All right, great. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us at today's Soup with Substance titled Peacemaking Amidst a Dual Pandemic. We're really excited to hear from 4 students today who are Peacemaking Fellows. 3 of them were Summer Peacemaking Fellows this past summer. And then our 4th student is a Bud Frankel Fellow graduate student who will be sharing about his year-long fellowship. And so once again, this soup will be recorded, so you all are able to share this with other folks. But today we'll have the opportunity to hear from each student and then ask some questions directly following their presentations. So feel free to use the chat box to submit any questions that you have, or we'll have the opportunity for you to unmute and ask your question. But right now, I ask everyone to mute yourselves, please, just so that we can hear each other better. So we're going to start off with Mari Cruz. Mari Cruz Sanchez was an intern with Catholic Charities this past summer. And Mari, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Mari Cruz Sanchez. I graduated this past May. Class of COVID-19 or 2020. I was a psychology and social welfare and justice major with a peace studies minor and also a Latinx studies minor. And yeah, I completed my summer peacemaking fellowship with Catholic Charities. If you can click next, Teresa. And so Catholic Charities, Refugee and Immigration Services, Catholic Charities as a whole is a big nonprofit organization whose mission is to provide services to people in need, to advocate for justice and social structures, and to call for the entire church and other people of goodwill to do the same. So they offer a lot of different programs. They have like ESL programs, GED programs, citizenship classes, and then I specifically worked at their Refugee and Immigration Services program/location. And what RIS did was they provide essential services to immigrants and newcomers to this country that allows them to contribute and participate in our community. And they also advocate for immigration and refugee policies that protect families. If you could click next. Could you go to the next slide? Okay, there. Thank you. And the reason why I decided to complete my fellowship here was actually because I had been interning with Catholic Charities, Refugee and Immigration Services since the fall 2019 semester. I was initially interested in this placement after the border awareness experience. It was actually spring break of 2019, that's 2018, sorry about that. But yeah, that was honestly just a life-changing experience, and I encourage anyone to look into it. But yeah, my time there at the border really influenced what I wanted to do. And since I needed to complete an internship for my SOJ and my Peace Studies capstone, I decided to go with IRS. And also that's why I continued my fellowship there, because I had an existing relationship and network there. And I really wanted to continue the work that I had been doing since the fall. If you could go to the next slide. And so some of the role and the tasks that I completed while interning and both completing my fellowship here, it was a lot of translating, both for Spanish-speaking clients when they met with their attorney, but also translating different blog posts, transcripts for YouTube videos, and just other information to Spanish for the informational website that they had launched. They got a grant to start this website that just had a lot of information that was easy for people to access, both their clients and just the surrounding community. And so apart from translating, I even got to write some blog posts myself about different immigration policy updates and other important topics. I know DACA was a big thing this year, also the increase in USCIS fees. And then once COVID hit, we kind of changed our topics to COVID related things on how to be safe during COVID, what USCIS was doing during this time, and then also with like the CARES Act to see if undocumented or documented people either qualified for it. Same with unemployment, because that was a big topic that came up. Earlier in the semester, I was able to actually film a YouTube video in Spanish. It was very nerve-wracking, but it was honestly exciting, I think, to be able to film that video in Spanish. I went through the naturalization process, so kind of explaining how the interview goes, the civics test, and all of that. And I did it in Spanish. It was my first time doing that. And then I also had the opportunity to do research for client cases, in addition to completing some USCIS applications on my own. Obviously, they were checked by attorneys to make sure everything was okay, but it was really good experience getting to kind of do that on my own, and then getting feedback from the attorneys and other people I worked with. I was able to write affidavits of support for client cases, and then just other administrative tasks like setting appointments, contacting clients for information or things like that. And this was what I did throughout since like the fall of 2019. And the only thing that COVID really changed was that everything was online. I was no longer able to meet with clients in person. But I think the work that I was still doing with like the website and the translating was still really important. And I recognized that it was something that needed to be done. And so, yeah, the only thing that COVID really took away from this was not being able to meet with the clients and meet with them. But other than that, most of my tasks stayed the same and it was still beneficial. And then how this fellowship with Catholic Charities relates to peacemaking and nonviolence. I think the best way to describe or identify the work that I did with Catholic Charities would be through the strategy of principled nonviolence. And so the goal of this strategy is to transform relationships and societies through direct action so that people are not exploited or oppressed. And I think that working on that informational website and the YouTube videos was a good tool for this strategy. So as a whole, the website and the YouTube videos provided information to clients and the surrounding community about different important topics. Like I said, we covered not only immigration, but once COVID hit, we turned to that as well. Because a lot of the information that was getting sent out, whether it was like from a USCIS website or news sources, could be really hard to understand for people who they don't have that level of education or where English is not their first language. So translating those to Spanish was really important. And yeah, I put the quote or the thing that says power with others because I think we were really working with our clients and with the community rather than for them, and just bringing them into the process of whatever their case may be, really explaining like step by step what would be happening, and then also giving them that access to information and access to education through YouTube videos or social media posts or that website that we created. And so this fellowship had a huge impact on me personally and professionally. I think it really led to, I always had intentions of going to law school, but it really kind of furthered that, it really confirmed that that's what I want to do. And it even influenced my work that I am doing right now. I recently was hired with Public Allies, Milwaukee, and I will be serving with them for 10 months. And I will actually be partnering with the Milwaukee Justice Center. So all that legal background, all that legal work that I did with Catholic Charities is definitely going to help me out here with MJC. And I'm really excited for that. And I also just want to end with encouraging all students to apply to this fellowship. You can really make of it what you want. If you have different interests or passions, I can 100% guarantee that Parisa or someone in the center will for sure help you integrate both peacemaking and nonviolence work into it, and it could be great for you. So yeah, that was my fellowship experience. Does anyone have any questions for me?
This is Patrick. I have one question. I noticed you were talking about sort of doing some of the behind the scenes stuff with the website, the COVID, some direct service stuff, and some policy stuff. When you think about nonviolence, how do all three of those things, those are three different dimensions of peacemaking, how do you make sense of those and what should be done, or a mixture? I don't know if you could talk a little bit about the different elements of your experience in bringing about change.
Yeah, so I think they all were very different. Sorry, it's okay. I think I did a lot of different things, like you said, policy and then education. But I think they all work towards the same goal of making sure that that the people that we serve are as much as part of the process as we're bringing them into the process rather than just like doing the work for them or serving them, because again, this is with immigration, this is their life that is in our hands, and also the information that we have could be really helpful to not just them but other community members. And so I'm going to bring this quote in from PA, from Public Allies, that I heard just this week actually during orientation, and someone said that nothing about us without us is for us. And that's kind of confusing, but I had to think about it. But if we're not bringing our community in to the work that we want to do to make it better, or to, highlight these assets that we have or things like that, then is it really for us or for them? So that's, I think, my biggest takeaway from the fellowship was that we have to work with our community as much as possible to really make the change that we want to see. And so I think, yeah, that was my biggest takeaway from this experience, and honestly it's probably gonna keep going into my public ally work.
Awesome. Thanks, Pat, for your question. Anne, did you have a question? Anne, I think you're muted. You just muted again. I'm not sure.
All right. Are there detention centers in Milwaukee area? Are you working with people in those situations? Did you work with them?
Not with my fellowship. I don't think there's detention centers in Milwaukee. I think there's one in Kenosha. But during my time at the border with the border awareness experience, I was down in El Paso, and we worked with Annunciation House, which was a nonprofit that helps people after they had been released from ICE detention centers. And that was honestly what led me to wanting to do this internship with RIS. But no, not in Milwaukee, but I did have experience down in El Paso when I went for spring break.
Thank you.
Thank you. Awesome. Thank you, Anne, for your question. Thank you again, Maddie. We appreciate you joining us today. And now we'll move on to Will Goltra's presentation.
Okay, thank you.
Alrighty, you guys. Yeah, so as the title slide reads, I'm Will Goltra. I'm a sophomore at Marquette, undergraduate sophomore at Marquette, majoring in Peace Studies and International Affairs. Before I begin, I would just like to thank the Center for Peacemaking for constantly being such a solid presence at my time at Marquette, and then also those who were able to contribute to the fellowship project. Obviously, without you guys, I wouldn't have been able to do this, so thank you. Also, before I go to the first slide, I would just like to give you a background on Nonviolent Peace Force. Nonviolent Peace Force is an organization that practices unarmed civilian protection around the world. Looking forward, I'm just going to refer to this as the acronym UCP. UCP is the protection of civilians without the threat of arms. That is to say, without the use of weapons. Alrighty, so just as a little background on my fellowship project, so Nonviolent Peace Force carried out 5 regional workshops around the world to basically bring together UCP practitioners to basically discuss what they do in the field to bring about the best possible outcome for their work. All that was said at these regional workshops were documented in these outcome documents. And what Nonviolent Peace Force wanted to do is they wanted researchers to come in and compare these outcome documents with contemporary UCP research. And so this is where me and my research team came into play. There were over 70 different good practices documented, and due to time restraints, we only focused on 7. They are listed below. The bolded ones I will speak about more in my findings tab in the next one. And the ones that are not bolded, I'll provide you guys with a definition here. These definitions weren't necessarily novel creations of our research, but were further refined because of our research. So with regards to anti-colonialism, anti-colonialism is much like, it is a process of reflection. Traditionally speaking, UCP organizations are those that come from the global north and use their white skin privilege to protect in the global south. Unfortunately, what's usually accompanied with this is the notion that those from the global north are somehow enlightened, meaning they know how to protect themselves and others, while those from the global south don't know how to do that. That's a really colonialistic approach that we seek to abolish in general, but especially in the field of UCP. And that's done through constant reflection work and constant reflection workshops, where UCP practitioners seek to, unquote, decolonize the mind and get rid of this notion. Accompanying is one of the more, accompanying is one of the more technical terms of UCP. It is quite literally using your physical presence to protect individuals or groups afflicted by violence, going from one area to the next, or remaining sedentary in a single position. Nonpartisan, I was telling Farisa this last week. Nonpartisanship made me want to tear what little hair I have out of my head, largely because when we were interviewing practitioners, not only was this not an agreed upon good practice, but those who did agree it was a good practice didn't share a uniform definition for it. For this reason, I'll provide you guys with just a brief, simplistic definition. It's basically when there's two conflicting parties, you are in the middle, so as to create space for diplomatic engagement between the two without the use of arms. You're equally close or equally distant to both parties. And then lastly, advocacy. To increase the viability of UCP, you must increase its visibility. That is to say, the more people see this as an option to conflict resolution, to protection, the more they will see it as a live, viable option for them. Alrighty, so just going over the general overview of our project. So as I mentioned earlier, we carried out a literature review where we compared the outcome documents to these regional workshops to contemporary UCP research to basically see the overlaps with regards to these UCP practices and how you carry them out in the field, where they were similar, where they were different, and we put all that we found into a research matrix, just basically to organize our research. What followed from this were interviews where we actually interviewed contemporary practitioners of UCP and asked them, so, you have all these different good practices, but how do you actually carry them out in the field? What followed from this was transcribing these interviews and then further coding them for when they were actually talking about these good practices. And then what logically followed from this was our writing. What did we find? So this list is super inexhaustive. Due to time restraints, I just won't be able to get to all that we found. But I thought these were just key highlights that I think are important for the common layperson to know about UCP that we found in regards to our research project. So relationship building. Relationship building is the heart and soul of UCP. That is to say, when you go into a community to implement UCP, you need to have a buy-in process from the local community. That is to say, they actually need to see this as a viable option for themselves. In other words, they need to have trust in you. And the only way you develop that trust is through the development of relationships. Now, that's all fine and dandy, but how do you actually even begin to do that? One practitioner summed it up best when he said, when we go into a community, we don't just speak with the most influential leader in that community. We go to all the various demographics of the community, the mamas of the community, the youth of the community, et cetera, et cetera. And we not only introduce ourselves to them, but we humanize them. We recognize their struggle and we sympathize and empathize with them as is appropriate. And this kind of starts the development of for lack of a better, like a relationship of reciprocity where your trust and faith and where your trust and openness with them leads to trust and openness from them to you, sparking this relationship of trust. Next, primacy of local actors, also really heart and soul of UCP. This is all about putting the local actor at the forefront of your work. That is to say, to involve them in the peace process. Now, what kind of confounded us as researchers at the beginning of the summer was, we were looking at all this research and they were always talking about, primacy of local actors, super important. But not once did they truly define, who is the local actor. If you really think about it, if you just say local actor, that's a police officer, that could mean a government official, and then just normal lay people, civilians. As a product of our research, speaking with contemporary UCP practitioners, we discovered that the local is that who is most oppressed. The individual who can experience their rights to life, their human rights, their right to life the least. Once you identify who this is, you can then start to dedicate time and resources to them, but you cannot start to do this until you have identified who they are. And thanks to our research, we're now able to do that. And then lastly, capacity enhancement. Capacity enhancement is all about identifying the local security structures of a community and enhancing them. So as one day the UCP organization that is there can leave, and that community can protect themselves independent of that organization. Now, capacity enhancement entails the three prerequisites, all of which I've defined, all of which I've previously defined. So with regards to primacy local actor, again, that's all about putting the local at the forefront of your work. And capacity, when you capacitate a community, you're literally involving them in the peace process and letting their experience, their lived experience, guide this peace process. Anti-colonialism, again, that's all about abolishing this notion that only those from the global north can protect. When you are capacitating a community and you're going into this community asking them, you know, what is your protection capabilities? You're inherently abolishing this notion that only you, the global northerner, can protect. And then lastly, relationship building. The only way you can get a community to share their existing security structures that they've used to protect themselves and share it with you is through trust. And again, the only way you develop that trust is the development of relationships. And so all of this we found as a product of our research. You good? So yeah, just general reflections of my fellowship. So 3 primary takeaways that I had. So as you guys know, this was all remote research over this past summer. I would love to actually one day couple my research with actual hands-on field work. I think this would be a really unique experience. And this could be either research in the field of UCP or any other field for that matter. I would just love to actually get hands-on experience. Next, so as I said, relationship building is like a key tenet to UCP. And that kind of has a special significance to me as I'm someone who, you know, when I go out into the world, I genuinely hold dear the development of relationships. I think it enhances the human experience. And to know that UCP holds this as a key tenet for their work really means a lot to me. And then lastly, this is a quote by Leela Watson. She's an Indigenous individual from Australia. We didn't interview her, but she's very well known in the humanitarian sector. I won't read this quote verbatim. You guys can read this, but I just want to give it from my perspective. You know, so at the beginning of the summer, I was constantly telling myself, you know, I want to like in the future, like with this hands-on experience, this field work that I would like to do one day. You know, I want to go into these communities that are afflicted by violence and work for them. That's not the appropriate perspective. When you want to go into these communities, you want to go into these communities that are afflicted by violence to work with them. That is to say, you realize that your liberation, your security, your safety is ultimately tied up with those of South Sudan, of Northern Kurdistan, Iraq, et cetera, et cetera. And so I've just kind of developed this perspective as a result of this research that I was doing, which has had a profound effect on me as a nonviolence advocate and hopefully one day practitioner. And then lastly, so this was all super broad brushstroke. I would love when our written work is published, I'm not sure when that should be. I think it should be October, possibly November. I would love to communicate with the Center for Peacemaking and get this work to you guys because it dives in a lot deeper into what we really did and the more nuances of the work. Oh, and lastly, again, the Center for Peacemaking and this fellowship opportunity has both transformed me personally, both like professionally, of course, but also emotionally. I've gained experiences that I wouldn't otherwise have had I not been with the Center for Peacemaking and had I not taken this experience with the fellowship. So, in sum, thank you guys. So, yeah.
Awesome, thanks, Will. Any questions for Will? Yes, go ahead, Tom.
Hi, Will. Thank you for that. I do have a question. And one of the things you mentioned is you talk about buy-in in the communities that you would work in. I have a question, and this kind of relates to because I teach the intro course in the spring, and I know about half my students already are kind of where you're at. The other half are not, and I'm interested in what your perspective is. Like, how do we get buy-in from young people who have been conditioned to see violence as a solution, and perhaps they believe it's the only solution? How do we reach more people to get involved?
Right. Well, it's funny you mentioned that because that kind of plays into this practice that I mentioned of advocacy. You know, to increase the viability of UCP, you need to increase its visibility. You need to increase educating, lobbying for this practice. Traditionally speaking, at least in the United States, you know, we've had this paradigm of, you know, the military is the first response, first answer to, you know, terrorist attacks, et cetera, et cetera. We need to promote the advocacy of this type of work in order to transform our minds. But of course, that's a long-term process, but nonetheless important. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah. I'm just trying to think like how do we get more people aware that this is a real possibility?
Yeah, that's a great. I mean, as it relates to UCP in countries like South Sudan, communities ended up really accepting this. Yes, from all the various demographics, but usually when an influential leader also agreed with it, their influence kind of had effect on the rest of the community. I think that same principle applies to, the United States. If we had a president who, actually thought about nonviolent solutions before we went gung-ho in the military, I think that would kind of spread throughout our country. And it doesn't just have to be the president, but, like local government officials, et cetera, et cetera. I just think influential characters, it needs to start with one and then permeate throughout the rest. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you, Tom, for your question. Let's see. Terry, is your hand up?
Yes.
Do you have a question? Yes.
Yeah. So just building off of Tom's point and the response, I think one of the most critical things, like you're demonstrating with Southern Sudan, are the case studies where it was a success. I think there's so much violence that is discussed in such a visible way on social media and other places, that this process of nonviolent intervention has these situations like Southern Sudan, certain tribal violence, even in Kenya, even certain interventions in Palestine, that are really significant, but are not known, or students are not aware of those cases where it has been a success. So it's almost like the default is the violent response instead of the default is the nonviolent response as represented in these case studies. But one of the questions I have for Will is, really about this relationship building that you talk about. You did this analysis, rightfully so, of colonial mindset and breaking that, and then you talked about going into the need to develop relationships with all the stakeholders, not just in Southern Sudan, and that's the situation I'm most familiar with the Sudanese Dinka or tribal leaders, but also with the women's groups, the youth groups, the medical clinics, etc. But what is the analysis there of doing that in a violent situation, in an eruption? And most of my experience dates from the mid-90s, when the Sudanese, the different tribal groups were literally at civil war with each other. Have you done any analysis about that, of how do you do relationship building in the midst of the conflict itself, as solutions for introducing nonviolence into the situation?
Yeah. Really good question. You're reminding me of one thing that was introduced to us through our research, and that is the notion of an entry point. An entry point can be like a physical location, or that can mean an individual. Again, that doesn't have to be necessarily a super influential person, but it can mean someone who, has existing relationships in the community. So as when this UCP organization goes into this community, they get in touch with that one person who has already these existing relationships with the rest of the community, and this existing relationship can guide the UCP people to these relationships in a manner that would be more difficult had that individual not been there, and it's just this UCP organization going in there by themselves. Does that make sense?
Thank you. The entryway, key relationships that you need to develop, and some of those pre-exist, but some are developed in the midst of that conflict. So great. Thank you. Great analysis and study.
Thank you, Terry. Appreciate it.
Awesome. Thank you, Tom and Terry, for your questions. And thank you again, Will, for presenting on your work. I'm really looking forward to reading that report.
Totally.
Thanks again.
I'm excited.
So we're going to move on to our next student. Daisy is a junior who is going to be sharing about her fellowship with a Catholic religious leadership in Latin America. Daisy?
Hi, I'm actually a senior, and I'm working with the Chicago Religious Leadership Network on Latin America. That's okay. My majors are sociology, political science, and peace studies. And good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining in. And I wanted to say Feliz Día de la Independencia de México. Happy Independence Day to Mexico. And as Parisa might have mentioned, I am continuing or delivering my presentation today on continuing my fellowship with CRLN, an interfaith organization that is working to dismantle harmful economic and military policies towards Latin America and advocating for immigrant justice in the US. So non-violently, of course, and mostly remotely, but not entirely. And we'll get into that. So for everyone not super familiar with policy advocacy work, the internal and external proceedings are really vast, but they take many forms. And CRLN is tasked with building partnerships among social movements and organized communities locally and globally. So what does that look like in our areas? Parisa, you can click to the next slide. It looks like recognizing that racism is a pandemic, and that colorism, imperialism, militarization, and state violence are pandemics as well. So working with Latin America specifically, we have recently called for Black and Brown solidarity against white supremacy and police violence. Next slide, please. We understand how calls to defund police are directly linked to defunding the military as well. And that's why tinkering with the ideas of capitalism and imperialism are no longer enough. We need to radically shape all of the worlds that we're a part of for our collective world community, which is why CRLN endorses these 10 demands of Black Lives Matter Chicago, which are close home and square, CPAC now, no cops in schools, accountability for police murder and torture, justice for all killed by police, fire murderous and abusive cops, end youth incarceration, defund the police, invest in community resources, and release police torture survivors. So these are the 10 demands that Black Lives Matter released earlier in the summer, and I know the visual is hard to read, so you can find them at blacklivesmatterchicago.org. And on CRLN's website, you can also find the openly condemn anti-Black attacks along with other Latinx community organizations that CRLN has signed on to. Because as a collective, we are aware that anti-Blackness is a tool that has long been used in US history to separate, divide, and pin oppressed communities against each other. And throughout US history, this is only shown to benefit white supremacist systems. Moving forward, CRLN is a network of interfaith action, education, and advocacy. So as I mentioned, mostly remote, but at times socially distant. We were able to participate in the hashtag Free Susana Prieto social media blast. Susana Prieto is a labor rights lawyer who was arrested in earlier June with charges of inciting a riot, threats, and coercion. CRLN joined in on the action to demand the Mexican consulate to press for her release. In a social media blast and delivering our message to the consulate, she has since been released but banned from traveling to the US. And this is just one of the many ways that CRLN has been able to continue our efforts. Very limited, of course, but remotely and of course connected with other organizations. Another effort that garnered some media attention was for no implementation of the ICE Academy. CRLN, with the St. Louis Interfaith Committee on Latin America and Organized Communities Against Deportations, are circulating organizational sign-on letters directed to local, state, and federal authorities to put an immediate stop to the implementation of ICE's Citizens Academy, set to start in Chicago on September 15th, 2020. So surprise, that was yesterday. In the nature and spirit of advocacy that is ever changing, there have been updates to this alert. And of course, not in the best news, but ICE has postponed the effort for sometime spring 2021. No official date has been released. So we'll get to do that all over again and keep lookout on the news and such. Next slide, please. One element of my fellowship from last summer that continued into the year was CRLN's support of me and the Hyde Camp Scholar Fund to my 2019 delegation to Havana, Cuba, with the Witness for Peace Solidarity Collective, entitled Healing Our Land, Healing Ourselves. So the Report Back webinar series is available at crln.org/Cuba on the program area. But essentially, this was a delegation that I agreed upon sometime around this time last year, around October. And the delegation took place in December for people looking to experience what healing our land, healing ourselves entailed. You can click the next slide. It took place December 11th to 20th of 2019, and the flyer said, on this delegation, social workers, educators, and first responders, those who experience and hold trauma, will exchange with Cuban organizers and healers to share strategies for community organizing, environmental justice, and nurturing. So all of that entailed, I divided up the webinar series into 3 separate parts. Urban economics and agriculture was the first. There's a picture of me in Cuba, but you can go ahead. The second part was U.S.-Cuba relations, cooperatives, and community, where I discussed a little bit about what solidarity with international movements actually looks like. My delegation was advocating against the embargo, because the embargo has aimed towards isolating the government, but it's essentially an international people's struggle. This genocidal blockade that's been in place for years. I discussed a little bit on the history, and the delegation was formed on solidarity, collaboration, and creative emergent strategies with partners in Cuba in resisting US imperialism. Before COVID, Cuba remained the only country that the US prohibited tourist travel to. Enabling it would require repealing of the trade sanctions reform and export enhancement reform. So you can look out for legislation, because as we're all like nonviolent advocates, we should exert our privileges where possible. And a lot of the times this form of foreign policy goes under the rug, is maybe taken over by rich lobbyists, but this is still very much a necessary issue. And even though my delegation was in December, again, there are updates to this now. This genocidal blockade is blocking Cuba from receiving necessary medical supplies in the midst of a pandemic, which we're all aware of. But next slide, please. So, of course, I was really excited to do a series on the healthcare system, asking clients or patients. And I started it off with a discussion about healing and social justice, because healing is ultimately a social justice issue. This quote from Cara Page and the Kindred Southern Healing Justice Collective reminds us that healing justice identifies how we can holistically respond to and intervene on generational trauma and violence, and to bring collective practices that can impact and transform the consequences of oppression on our bodies, hearts, and minds. So similar to my delegation, this collective is based in primarily being a space for activists, offering body work and counseling while dealing with these very existential issues. Next slide, please. So the connection with nonviolence and nonviolent advocacy is that we're all aware of the consequences abroad, but really importantly, domestically, of institutional violence posing a threat to marginalized communities globally. And one thing I learned distinctly this summer from my experience is that policy work is a field of endeavor that is dispiriting. We must have other solutions and sources of renewal. We can't always look to politics or find solution in that, because sometimes the work is within ourselves, and all it takes is for us to be able to continue to advocate for these issues as best as possible. And of course, as a religious community, faith requires us to keep working and understand that we can influence, but never control, which both of the speakers before me touched on a little bit. and because this program is directly shaped by the affected people in Latin America, we agree that amplifying and uplifting their voices and exerting our privilege when possible is what's going to be necessary for the adjustments towards change. So again, a little bit of a shameless plug. There are so many resources available at CRLN.org, which I highly recommend to everybody under the program areas. I wanted to say thank you to the Center for Peacemaking for all of your support and guidance through this experience, my CRLN staff, the board, the delegates who joined me on the Witness for Peace Solidarity Collective, Healing Our Land, Healing Ourselves delegation, and of course the Cuban people for offering so much.
Awesome. Thank you, Daisy. Any questions for Daisy?
Hey Daisy, can you say that link again? Sorry, the link to the website.
Yeah, CRLN.org.
Cool.
Thanks.
Cool. Thank you.
Laura, would you like to ask your question?
Hey everybody, so nice to see you. Daisy, could you talk a little bit more about how CRLN sees itself as being led by Latin Americans, or letting that part take the lead versus, I mean, I'm assuming it's a network of primarily non-Latin Americans in the Chicago area, but maybe I'm wrong about that. Can you just explain that a little bit?
You are so right. And you know, with like emerging strategies, this is kind of what we're I guess trying to bring into advocacy, is that the idea of delegations and mission trips could also be attributed to like a little bit of a colonial perspective, and you know, the idea of like wealthy people just kind of being able to afford going on these trips, and like what the intentionality behind it might be does have connotations. But CRLN as an organization is working to change that actively. Our head of immigration program is Juan Carlos Hernandez. He is of Latinx descent, and so is our executive director for the first time in the history of CRLN. So I think the main thing that organizations need to work on is leadership roles for including voices of people with the background that they're advocating for, right? Like not just using their information for policy, for informing policy, or I guess using them as a tool, but actually giving them the space and the time to, I mean, exert their self-advocacy, right?
Thank you, Laura, for your question. And thank you again, Daisy, for your great work. So we're going to move on to our last fellow for today, Mike Schmidt. He is our inaugural Bud Franco Fellow, and he is a graduate student in the political science department. Mike?
Yeah, hi everyone. As Parisa said, my name is Mike Schmidt. I'm a second-year master's student, getting my degree in political science, and am the inaugural Bud Franco Fellow, which I'm very excited for this academic year and also extremely thankful. Parisa, if you want to go to the next slide, please. So, as a Franco Fellow, one of my pretty much like the major tasks and thing going on is community-based research. So I thought it would be nice to highlight just kind of the initiatives and organizations that I'm working with. So anyone that is familiar with the center probably knows a little bit about PARC, but PARC is promoting assets, reducing crime. And it really focuses on community collaboration aimed at creating equitable and sustainable communities in the Near West Side. And it takes a 4-step model, which is diagnose issues, define intervention and strategy, implement strategy, and share results to see through creating that equitable and sustainable communities. And then PARC is a project and initiative led by Near West Side Partners. And Near West Side Partners is a neighborhood nonprofit organization, and their mission is pretty much to revitalize and sustain the Near West Side into a thriving business and residential community. And they emphasize a lot, and one of their building blocks is really focusing on gathering resident and stakeholder feedback to help improve the Near West Side. And then just highlighting in general on this map right here, you can see the 7 unique neighborhoods that make up the Near West Side, and they are really truly all unique. With my short experience so far as a Frankel Fellow, I've really been able to see the diversity, not only racial diversity, but also economic and housing diversity. With my project, I am focusing a lot on housing. And just to highlight there, 85% of the Near West Side population, which is about 24 to 25,000 residents, are renters. And there's also just a diverse housing stock going from large multi-family apartment buildings to duplexes to these old 1900s historical mansions. So it's really unique to see and a really cool opportunity. But the project that I am working on is called the Vacant Property Audit. And the Vacant Property Audit started from actually resident concerns to Near West Side Partners about increased disorder at vacant properties. There was 3 in particular. One property was becoming a hub for sex and human trafficking. Another property, an individual was falsely renting out the property to drug addicts. And then the last property, an individual was just falsely pretending to own the property. So Near West Side Partners worked with a bunch of organizations and a lot of social services, such as Sojourner Family Peace Center, to address these properties and connect residents to proper social services and housing services. In addition, the internal working teams with Near West Side Partners help kind of facilitate these connections, and Near West Side Partners was also able to connect some individuals to the Good Neighbor program, which connects to property owners and managers that go kind of above and beyond for the housing conditions. And so, Parisa, if you would like to go to the next slide. So, but this, after kind of addressing the short-term concerns, it brought about this opportunity, and this is where I really started to get involved with the Frankel Fellowship of doing a larger research project about housing, and specifically vacant properties in the Near West Side. And so this led to me and some undergraduate students at the center walking every single block of the Near West Side, recording any vacancies, property maintenance, overgrown lawns, vacant lots. And as you can see on this map, we kind of highlights where we were seeing that specifically in the neighborhood. The 2 main clusters were the Cold Spring Park neighborhood, which is kind of in the top middle area, and then the Merrill Park neighborhood, which is in the bottom middle. And they both kind of represented 2 different issues. Cold Spring Park had more property maintenance, specifically within that 33rd and 34th Street area, and then Merrill Park had a lot of vacancy issues, with 10 vacancies being specifically on Clybourne Street and then also Michigan Street. And then what was also really cool to see is we were able to take what we collected from the vacant property audit and walking the neighborhood and comparing it to 2015 numbers that Near West Side Partners had. And what we ended up seeing is in the Martin Drive neighborhood specifically, that there was 23 vacancies in 2015 compared to 5 this year. So that was something that was extremely encouraging. And then a lot of the other neighborhoods were relatively stable, like Miller Valley, Pigsville, Avenues West, didn't really see too much change. And now with me just starting this project and having the entire academic year, I'm now starting to transition from collecting the data and doing the surveying into thinking about next steps and ways to potentially help with these vacant properties. So two of the next steps that I've identified is trying to provide financial resources, so working with any lending institutions or banks, to property owners, and then identifying developers to potentially move forward with rehabilitation of vacant properties. But even going beyond that, something that I would like to develop and I'm working on is creating a model for vacant properties that other nonprofits or neighborhood organizations could take about how to potentially not only stabilize a vacant property if there is some sort of disorder, but then also rehabilitate it and try and create a similar model to Park in that sense. And then Parisa, if you want to go to the next slide. So far, I have, it's been just the beginning, I guess, of my fellowship, but what I've already seen is how much community building is peacemaking. The way that I look at the vacant property audit and really housing in the Near West Side and housing in general is that it is a human right, and that's something that I think deserves as much focus as possible. You know, providing quality, stable, and affordable housing to residents, making like is peacemaking in itself. Like no family, no individual or resident of the Near West Side should have to walk into their house and think that it might be unsafe or be concerned that their porch or their exterior isn't up to code or isn't safe for them. So we're really working that way to try and fix those problems and everything. And then next is the importance of community-based research. I thought one of the coolest things thus far with the fellowship is just being able to go out and walk around the Near West Side and connect with residents. There was a couple of instances where I was documenting vacant properties and I struck up a conversation with a resident, and it just led to talking about their concerns of their specific block, but also their hopes for what they want to see on the street or what they want to see in their neighborhood in general. And then also this summer, I was able to guide undergrads through a community-based research project, which was really honestly very rewarding to be with them through that experience, and then also provide them an opportunity to reflect on community-based research. I was really happy about doing that. And then lastly, I just want to say thank you to the Frankel Family Foundation. I'm extremely excited for this opportunity and really looking forward to this next year of research and making an impact in the Near West Side. So any questions for me?
Thanks, Mike. Any questions on the work that Mike is able to do through his fellowship? Pat?
Yeah, this is a question for Mike, but also maybe for each of the fellows who presented. Some folks are looking at these big international issues. Others are really hyper local, working on projects in your backyard, and you all touched a little bit on working with the people most impacted by problems and thinking of privilege and power and some of these dynamics, and at some level each of you come with some power and privilege and just the privilege to have these fellowship experiences. What sort of self-work have you engaged in as you approach that work?
Mike, would you like to answer that?
Yeah, I'm sorry, Pat. I didn't really hear the second half of that. Could you repeat that for me?
Oh, what sort of internal work did you need to do to prepare yourself to make sure that you're doing the work in a way that's equitable and ensures resident voice, or for the other fellows, the respective communities they're working with as part of that process?
Yeah, that is a great question. That's something that I definitely I struggled with a little bit at the beginning. I come from like a small town outside of Madison, and moving to Milwaukee was a big first for me in a sense of living in a big city in a sense. But I think when I was going into community-based research and talking to residents and everything like that, for me, the self-work that I had to do is just simply realizing my own privilege in that sense of coming out and actually doing the research and being open to hearing their ideas, residents' ideas, and just being open and almost like a sponge in a sense. I tried as much as possible to just kind of leave all of my I just tried as much as possible to reflect on that beforehand. I guess that was my take on going into and doing community-based research.
Awesome. Thank you, Pat, for your question. And Mike, thank you again for your work. Just because of time's sake, I'm going to wrap up our SOUP for today. So for those who are interested, for students who are on the call, or even faculty members on the call, if you would want to share about the Center for Peacemaking Fellowships, if you go to our website, you can find the Summer Peacemaking Fellowship information. Applications for that are due in February. And then for the Bud Frankel Fellowships, which is once again an annual fellowship, if graduate students are interested about that, you can check out our website as well. And then next Wednesday, we encourage you to join us at SOUP again. September 23rd, Midnight Run students will be sharing on community outreach on racial equity in Milwaukee. Thanks everyone for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you again at SOUP.
Have a good one, you guys.
Thanks, Parisa.